There is a strange pattern in human history. Every civilization leaves behind something it fears most. The Romans feared disorder. The Vikings feared dying without honor. Medieval Europe feared damnation. Ancient Egypt feared something that almost no civilization has ever placed at the center of its worldview. Not death. Forgetting. At first, that sounds impossible. After all, what civilization invested more effort in preparing for death than Egypt? They built pyramids that still dominate the horizon nearly 5,000 years later. They developed the most sophisticated embalming techniques of the ancient world. They filled tombs with food, furniture, clothing, jewelry, statues, boats, perfumes, games, musical instruments, even written instructions meant to accompany the dead into eternity. Everything about Egypt appears obsessed with dying. But appearances can be deceptive, and nowhere is that more true than here. Because the deeper historians learned to read Egyptian texts, a remarkable realization began to emerge. Death was never the real problem. Losing yourself was. That distinction changes almost everything. Imagine for a moment that someone erased every trace of your existence. Not your body, your identity. Every photograph disappears, every message you've ever written vanishes. Every person who ever knew you forgets your name. Your family no longer recognizes your face. Your achievements belong to someone else. Your memories exist only inside your own mind. Would you still be the same person? It sounds like the beginning of a science fiction novel. The Egyptians treated it as one of the most serious philosophical questions a human being could ask. Long before psychology, long before neuroscience, before Plato, before Aristotle, an ancient civilization living beside the Nile became fascinated by a mystery that still has no definitive answer. What is the one thing that must survive for you to remain you? That question became the foundation of everything they built, and strangely enough, it is still the question modern science continues asking. Today, neurologists study patients whose memories slowly disappear due to Alzheimer's disease. Psychologists investigate how trauma reshapes identity. Philosophers still argue over whether there is such a thing as a permanent self. Technology companies now debate whether human consciousness could ever be copied into machines. Different centuries, different vocabulary, the same mystery. What actually makes a person who they are? The Egyptians answered that question in a way almost nobody expects. Not with philosophy, with architecture, with rituals, with symbols, with stories, and with one extraordinary book. Or perhaps calling it a book is already our first mistake, because the most famous title in Egyptian history is also one of its greatest misunderstandings. Almost everyone has heard of the Book of the Dead. Few realize the Egyptians never used that name, not once. Imagine discovering a medical textbook 5,000 years from now, then renaming it the Book of Hospitals. The title wouldn't be entirely wrong. Hospitals are certainly connected to medicine, but it would completely miss the purpose of the book. That is exactly what happened here. The name The Book of the Dead was invented by a 19th century Egyptologist trying to classify hundreds of funerary manuscripts discovered inside tombs. It was practical, memorable, and profoundly misleading. The Egyptians called it something entirely different, the Book of Coming Forth by Day. Read those words carefully. Coming forth, not descending, not ending, not dying, coming forth. Already the story has changed. One title speaks about death, the other speaks about emergence. One suggests finality, the other suggests continuation. That single translation error quietly shaped the modern world's understanding of Egyptian civilization for nearly 200 years. But it also hides a much deeper question. Why would a civilization spend more than 3,000 years copying, revising, illustrating, and preserving a book whose purpose was not death, but continuation? What exactly were they trying to preserve? To answer that question, historians had to do something remarkably difficult. They had to stop looking at pyramids, Stop looking at mummies, stop looking at the treasure, and start reading what the Egyptians themselves had written. What they discovered was unexpected. Again and again, beneath every prayer, every ritual, every illustration, the same fear quietly appeared. Not pain, not punishment, not divine anger. Disappearance. The Egyptians believed a person could experience something worse than death. They could lose the continuity that made them themselves, their memories, their name, their identity, their inner coherence. Everything else in Egyptian civilization suddenly begins making sense once you understand that single idea. Why preserve the body with extraordinary care? Because continuity mattered. Why carve names into stone? Because continuity mattered. Why cover tomb walls with stories? Because continuity mattered. Why believe the heart would one day reveal the truth of your life? Because continuity mattered. The entire civilization appears to orbit one invisible principle. Human beings survive only if something essential remains unbroken. At first, this sounds like mythology, until we notice something uncomfortable. Modern life may describe the same experience differently. People say, "I don't know who I am anymore. I've lost myself. I'm not the person I used to be. I don't recognize my own life." Listen carefully. None of those sentences describes physical death. They describe the loss of identity. The Egyptians would have understood every one of them. Not because they anticipated modern psychology, but because they spent thousands of years asking the same question from another direction. How does a human being disappear without dying? That is the investigation we are about to begin, not into pyramids, not into curses, not into ancient magic, into one of the oldest theories of human consciousness ever written. Because hidden beneath the monuments, beneath the gods, beneath the funerary rituals, lies a possibility few people have ever considered. Perhaps the Book of Coming Forth by Day was never trying to teach people how to survive death. Perhaps it was trying to teach them how to avoid the one fate the Egyptians believed was even worse: forgetting who they were. Chapter 1. The greatest translation mistake in Egyptian history. There is a curious moment that happens to almost everyone who studies ancient Egypt seriously. At first, they think they're investigating a civilization. Then they realize they're actually investigating a misunderstanding. Not a small one that has survived for nearly 2 centuries. One that quietly changed how millions of people interpreted one of humanity's oldest philosophical traditions. The misunderstanding is only 4 words long: the Book of the Dead. Ask almost anyone what they imagine after hearing that title. The answers are remarkably similar. A collection of funeral rituals, magic spells, instructions for the afterlife, perhaps even a forbidden book hidden inside pyramids. The title creates those expectations before the first page is ever opened. There is only one problem. The Egyptians never called it that. Not once. Imagine if 5,000 years from now, archaeologists discovered every medical textbook produced in our century. Instead of reading them carefully, they simply noticed they were found inside hospitals. So they published them under one title: The Book of Hospitals. Technically, the books came from hospitals, but no one would mistake that for their real purpose. That is almost exactly what happened to the Egyptian text. When German Egyptologist Carl Richard Lepsius published one of the first major collections of these funerary papyri in 1842, he needed a practical title. He chose The Book of the Dead. The name was memorable, it was convenient, it spread across Europe almost immediately, and ever since then, the modern world has unconsciously read the entire work through that title. The Egyptians themselves used another name, Peret em Heru, usually translated as The Book of Coming Forth by Day. Those 2 titles describe completely different books. One speaks about endings, the other speaks about beginnings. One looks toward death, The other looks toward emergence. One imagines a corpse, the other imagines someone walking into the light. That single translation changes the entire investigation. Because if the book was really about coming forth, then death was never the destination. It was merely the doorway. And suddenly, a much more interesting question appears. Coming forth, as what? Not where, what? Who was expected to emerge? The same person who entered, or someone transformed? That question quietly sits beneath every chapter of the Egyptian text. The deeper scholars looked, the stranger the answers became. For centuries, Europeans believed these papyri were reserved exclusively for kings. It seemed logical. After all, the pyramids belonged to pharaohs. The great tombs belonged to pharaohs. Surely the sacred books belonged only to royalty. Then, archaeologists began opening more tombs. Not royal tombs, ordinary ones. Craftsmen, scribes, architects, merchants, military officers. Again and again, they found copies of the same text, sometimes beautifully illustrated, sometimes hastily copied, sometimes only a few chapters long, sometimes stretching more than 20 meters from beginning to end. No two copies were exactly alike. That surprised everyone. Modern readers instinctively expect sacred books to remain fixed. Open two copies of the same Bible. They are essentially identical. Open two Qurans. The structure remains the same. The Egyptian funerary manuscripts behaved completely differently. Imagine walking into a bookstore where every copy of the same novel contains different chapters, different illustrations, different endings. That would be unimaginable today. For the Egyptians, it was normal. Why? Because these papyri were never intended to become standardized religious books. They were personal guides, customized journeys. Every individual is prepared differently. Every life requires different protection. Every consciousness carried its own story. That realization completely transformed the way historians understood Egyptian religion. The Book of Coming Forth by Day was not a scripture. It was preparation for an experience that every Egyptian expected to face personally. Perhaps the most fascinating evidence comes from the workshops of professional scribes. For years, archaeologists wondered why certain funerary papyri contained strange blank spaces, entire lines carefully left empty. At first, they suspected damaged manuscripts, missing sections, careless copying. The truth was far more practical. The scrolls had already been written before they were sold. The prayers were complete, the illustrations were finished, everything was ready, except one thing: the owner's name. When a customer purchased the papyrus, the scribe simply filled each blank space with that person's name. Imagine buying an airline ticket where every destination has already been printed, but your own identity is added only moments before departure. That tiny detail tells us something extraordinary. The Egyptians believed these texts became effective only when they became personal. Without your name, they belonged to no one. With your name, they became yours uniquely. Now another mystery emerges. Why was the name so important? Why not simply identify the owner? Why repeat it dozens of times throughout the manuscript? Because according to Egyptian belief, a name did far more than identify someone. It preserved them. And once historians understood that, they began noticing something astonishing throughout Egyptian history. Whenever one ruler wanted to erase another, they rarely began by destroying the body. They destroyed the name. Why? Because they believed there was something even more permanent than flesh, and far more fragile than stone: identity itself. That discovery would force Egyptologists to completely rethink one of the most famous acts of political revenge in the ancient world. Because one queen, whose monuments still stand today, was almost erased from history for exactly that reason. Chapter 2. the queen they tried to erase. If the Egyptians believed that preserving a name preserved a person, then destroying a name meant something far more serious than political revenge. It meant attacking existence itself. For a long time, historians struggled to understand a peculiar pattern appearing across Egypt. Again and again, monuments had been deliberately damaged, not destroyed, edited. Faces remained untouched, bodies remained standing. Almost all the statues survived almost perfectly. Only one thing had been carefully removed: the names. At first, archaeologists assumed ordinary vandalism, centuries of looting, natural erosion, religious conflict. Then they noticed something impossible to ignore. The damage was too precise. Someone had worked methodically, cartouche after cartouche, inscription after inscription, one name at a time. It was as though history itself had been placed under careful revision. Perhaps the most famous example belongs to a ruler who should have been impossible to forget. A woman who governed one of the most powerful empires on earth. Her name was Hatshepsut. For more than 20 years she ruled Egypt during one of its most prosperous periods. Trade expanded farther than ever before. Temples rose across the Nile Valley. Monumental architecture flourished. The kingdom enjoyed remarkable stability. By almost every historical measure, she was an extraordinarily successful pharaoh. And yet, after her death, something extraordinary happened. Years later, workers began returning to her monuments, not to repair them, to erase them. Her statues were smashed, her cartouches chiseled away. Her images were removed from the temple walls. Entire sections of history quietly rewritten. For generations, historians believed this was simply personal hatred. Perhaps her successor wanted revenge. Perhaps later rulers disliked the idea of a female pharaoh. Those explanations may contain part of the truth, but they overlook something much deeper. The Egyptians themselves believed that removing a person's name threatened their continued existence. This was not merely rewriting history, it was a second execution. One is carried out long after physical death. Imagine someone deciding that prison was not enough, execution was not enough. Instead, they attempted to erase every trace that you had ever lived. No photographs, no books, no letters, no signatures, no gravestone, no memory. That was the Egyptian equivalent of complete annihilation. Suddenly, those damaged monuments tell an entirely different story. They are no longer acts of destruction. They are acts of metaphysical warfare. History itself became the battlefield, and Hatshepsut was not alone. More than a century later, another ruler experienced something remarkably similar, perhaps even more dramatically. His name was Akhenaten. Today, he is remembered as the pharaoh who attempted one of history's most radical religious revolutions. He elevated the worship of a single solar deity, the Aten, above Egypt's traditional gods. He built an entirely new capital, changed artistic conventions, reshaped religious life. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Egypt itself had become a different civilization. Then he died. Almost immediately, the old order returned. His city was abandoned, his temples dismantled, his statues are broken apart, his name disappeared from official king lists. Future generations referred to him only indirectly, sometimes not at all. Again, modern historians naturally explain this as politics, religious reaction, the restoration of tradition, all true. But from the Egyptian point of view, another layer existed beneath the political one. If memory preserved existence, then erasing memory attacked existence. That changes the way we should read Egyptian civilization. We often imagine their obsession with permanence as vanity, kings wanting glory, monuments celebrating power. Perhaps that happened. Kings are still human, but the evidence suggests something larger. Egypt was trying to build a civilization that resisted forgetting itself. Stone instead of wood, granite instead of mud brick, monuments instead of temporary buildings. Hieroglyphs were carved into cliffs rather than painted on walls. They were building against time, against erosion, against oblivion. Not because they believed stone lived forever, nothing does, but because stone remembered longer than flesh. This raises another fascinating question. If preserving your name mattered so much, what exactly was a human being? Surely a person could not simply be a body carrying a name. The Egyptians thought the answer was far more complicated. In fact, they believed one of the greatest mistakes anyone could make was imagining that a human being possessed only one soul. According to them, you were never one person. You were several. And understanding that idea changes everything we think we know about the Egyptian view of consciousness. Chapter 3. The Egyptians never believed you had one soul. There is a question that sounds almost too simple. How many people are you? Most of us answer without hesitation. One. One body, one mind, one identity, one self. It feels so obvious that we rarely stop to examine it. The Egyptians did. And they reached a conclusion that still feels startling 4,000 years later. They believed a human being was not one thing, it was a collection. Several different realities are temporarily held together. At first glance, that sounds like mythology, until we notice something curious. Modern language constantly describes us the same way. Part of me wants to leave. Another part of me is afraid. I don't feel like myself. I need to find myself again. Listen carefully. Without realizing it, we already speak as though more than one version of ourselves exists. Modern psychology simply gives those experiences different names. The Egyptians gave them symbols. But before we explore those symbols, another mystery deserves our attention. Archaeologists had spent decades excavating Egyptian tombs before they noticed something unusual. Again and again, the same images appeared. A bird, with the head of a human. At first, 19th century scholars assumed it represented the soul. Problem solved. Except it didn't, because another symbol appeared just as often. Two raised human arms. Sometimes standing beside the deceased, sometimes embracing them. If the bird was the soul, what were the arms? Then came another symbol, a shining human figure surrounded by light. Then another, the shadow. Then another, the name. The deeper scholars looked, the less the idea of a single soul seemed to fit. Eventually, they reached an unavoidable conclusion. The Egyptians were not describing one invisible self, they were describing several. Not because they enjoyed complexity, because they believed consciousness itself was complex. The first of these was called the Ka. Most books translate it as life force. That isn't wrong, it simply isn't enough. Imagine identical twins standing side by side, one made of flesh, the other invisible. That is how Egyptian artists often represented birth. The creator god Khnum sits before a potter's wheel. From the same clay, he shapes two figures, not one. The child and the child's Ka. One enters the visible world, the other accompanies it, from the very first breath. The Ka was not a personality, it was vitality. The mysterious difference between a living body and a dead one. Today, we explain that difference biologically. Cells cease functioning, organs fail, electrical activity stops. The Egyptians observed the same reality, they simply described it differently. Something invisible had departed. That invisible presence was the Ka. This also explains one of the most misunderstood discoveries inside Egyptian tombs. Walk through any museum displaying funerary objects, and you'll notice something strange. Tables overflowing with food, bread, beer, wine, fruit, geese, oxen. Entire feasts were prepared for someone who could no longer eat. For centuries, historians debated their purpose. Were they symbolic, ceremonial, expressions of wealth. The Egyptians themselves left a simpler answer. The ka still required nourishment, not physical nourishment, essential nourishment. The visible food remained, its invisible reality was received elsewhere. Whether we interpret that literally or symbolically is less important than the principle beneath it. Reality possessed more than one layer. The visible depended upon something invisible. The second aspect of the person was even more fascinating, the ba. If the ka represented life itself, the ba represented individuality, your personality, your temperament, your unique way of existing. This is why Egyptian artists portrayed it as a bird with a human face. Not because they imagined people becoming birds, because birds travel, they leave, they return. Every morning, the ba was believed to leave the tomb. It could visit familiar places, observe loved ones, move freely between worlds. Every evening, it returned. Immediately, another famous Egyptian custom begins making much more sense. Why preserve the body so carefully? Modern culture usually answers with one word: immortality. The Egyptians gave a more practical answer: recognition. The ba needed somewhere to return. Imagine arriving home after decades away, only to discover your entire neighborhood has disappeared. No streets, no house, no landmarks, nothing remains. The Egyptians imagined something similar. Without continuity, recognition becomes impossible. Again, notice how modern this sounds. Patients suffering from advanced dementia often recognize emotions before they recognize faces. Eventually, they may stop recognizing even those closest to them. The deepest tragedy is not memory alone. It is the gradual collapse of continuity. The Egyptians transformed that terrifying possibility into the image of the ba searching for the body it once knew. Different symbols, the same human fear. But neither the ka nor the ba represented the highest possibility of human existence. That belonged to something far more mysterious. Something that could never simply be inherited. It had to be achieved. The Egyptians called it the ak. And unlike everything we have discussed so far, the ak was not what you were born with. It was what you became. The first time Egyptologists translated the texts describing the ak, many assumed they were simply reading another word for spirit. It seemed like the obvious conclusion. Every religion has a word for the soul. Why should Egypt be different? But the more the texts were translated, the less that explanation worked. Because the ak was not something every person automatically possessed. It was something every person hoped to become. That single distinction changes everything. Imagine the difference between being born with the ability to read and becoming a great writer. One is potential, the other is transformation. The ak belonged to the second category. It represented a human being who had passed through every stage of existence without losing the thread that held the self together. A consciousness that had become complete. The Egyptians often associated the ak with light, not ordinary light, the light of the stars that never seemed to disappear. Unlike the sun, which vanished every evening below the horizon, certain stars remained visible throughout the year. To the Egyptians, permanence mattered. Anything that endured became a symbol of continuity. The ak belonged to that category, not because it had escaped change, but because it had successfully passed through it. That is a remarkably sophisticated idea. Most modern discussions about immortality ask a simple question. Can we continue living? The Egyptians asked a more difficult one. If we continue, what exactly continues? Those are not the same question. Imagine copying every memory from your mind into a machine. Would that machine be you? Or would it simply possess your memories? Philosophers still argue about that problem today. The Egyptians approached it from another direction. They believed continuity required more than memory, more than a body, more than a name. Everything essential had to remain connected. Only then could a person become an ak. It is difficult not to notice how often this same intuition appears throughout history. The alchemists spoke about transforming base metals into gold. The Stoics spoke about becoming a wise person rather than merely acquiring knowledge. Christian mystics described spiritual rebirth. Buddhist traditions described awakening. Different civilizations, different centuries, one recurring idea. Human beings are unfinished. Life is not simply about surviving, it is about becoming. The Egyptians expressed that possibility nearly 2,000 years before Socrates. But perhaps the most surprising part of their understanding of the self had nothing to do with invisible souls at all. It had to do with something every one of us uses every day: our name. The Egyptians called it the Ren. At first, that hardly sounds extraordinary. Every culture gives names. Parents choose them. Governments record them. Friends speak them. Why would the Ren deserve its own place alongside the Ka and the Ba? Because the Egyptians believed your name did much more than identify you. It preserved you. Think about how naturally we still treat names today. We name buildings after remarkable people. We preserve signatures. We place names on gravestones. Parents pass family names across generations. Entire histories are organized around remembered names. Without realizing it, we still behave as though names carry something larger than sound. The Egyptians simply made that belief explicit. As long as your name continued to be spoken, part of your existence continued as well. That conviction explains something archaeologists noticed throughout Egypt long before they understood why it mattered. Names appear everywhere, not only on royal monuments, on furniture, walking sticks, mirror cases, jewelry, amulets, tools, even children's toys. The first assumption was obvious: decoration, status, ownership. Eventually, another possibility emerged. Perhaps these objects were not merely identifying their owners. Perhaps they were helping preserve them. That idea suddenly made sense of one of the strangest practices in Egyptian history. When a ruler wanted to erase an enemy, they often ignored the body. Instead, they attacked the name. Because if the Ren disappeared, the continuity of the individual itself became threatened. Modern historians call this damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. The Romans practiced it, the Egyptians perfected it. It was not simply political revenge, it was philosophical annihilation. Imagine someone deleting every trace of your existence, every photograph, every letter, every digital record, every mention of your name, every story told about your life. One generation later, it would seem as though you had never existed at all. The Egyptians considered that possibility more terrifying than physical death. And perhaps they were asking a question that still has no comfortable answer. How much of who we are survives once no one remembers us? That question would lead them to one final discovery, one part of the human being that could never be erased from the outside. One witness who remembered everything, even when every monument had collapsed, every inscription had vanished, and every name had fallen silent. The Egyptians believed that witness was already beating quietly inside every living person: the heart. Chapter 4. Why the Egyptians preserved the heart, but threw away the brain. Imagine walking into an ancient Egyptian embalming workshop. The room is quiet. The body has already been washed with water from the Nile. Priests move deliberately. Every action follows a sequence refined over centuries. Nothing is accidental. Nothing is rushed. Then something happens that still surprises people today. The embalmers remove the brain. Not carefully, not reverently. A metal hook is inserted through the nostril. The delicate tissue is broken apart. Small fragments are withdrawn piece by piece. The remaining matter is liquefied and drained. In many cases, it is simply discarded. The heart remains untouched. If you had witnessed this process without knowing anything about Egypt, what conclusion would you reach? Probably the same one historians have reached for generations. The Egyptians didn't understand anatomy. It seemed obvious. How could a civilization capable of building pyramids fail to recognize that the brain controls thought? The answer seemed embarrassingly simple. They were brilliant engineers, poor biologists. For nearly 2 centuries, that explanation remained largely unquestioned. Then something unexpected happened. Scholars stopped asking whether the Egyptians understood the brain. Instead, they began asking a different question. What problem were they actually trying to solve? Those are not the same investigation. Modern neuroscience asks where memory is stored. The Egyptians never asked that. They asked something much more difficult. Where does a person's truth live? That changes everything, because facts and truth, they are not identical. You can forget the name of your first teacher, forget a childhood address, forget what you ate last Tuesday. None of those things fundamentally changes who you are. But live selfishly for 30 years, or generously for 30 years, and something far deeper changes. Not your memory, your character. The Egyptians believed the heart carried that memory. Not information, transformation. Think about how naturally we still describe human beings today. We don't admire someone because they possess a remarkable brain. We admire them because they have a generous heart, a courageous heart, an honest heart. When someone betrays us, we rarely say they have a defective hippocampus. We say they became hard-hearted, cold-hearted, heartless. Modern medicine and everyday language have quietly divided reality into 2 different conversations. Medicine studies the organ. Human experience still uses the symbol. The Egyptians never separated the 2. For them, the heart was not simply pumping blood. It was silently recording the person you were becoming. That idea appears throughout Egyptian literature with astonishing consistency. Again and again, the heart is described as something that knows, something that remembers, something that cannot be deceived. Not because it possesses magical powers, because every choice gradually reshapes it. There is a fascinating detail hidden inside the Egyptian language itself. The word for heart, ib, appears in contexts where modern English would use words like mind, intention, understanding, or even conscience. In other words, the Egyptians never drew the sharp line between thinking and being that modern culture often assumes. To them, what you repeatedly chose became what you eventually were. That observation feels remarkably contemporary. Behavioral psychology tells us that repeated actions slowly become automatic. Neuroscience describes neural pathways strengthening through repetition. The Stoics argued that every action either strengthens or weakens character. James Allen wrote that repeated thinking gradually crystallizes into destiny. Different centuries, different vocabulary. The Egyptians would probably have summarized all of it with a single sentence. Your heart remembers. And that brings us to the most famous image in all of Egyptian civilization, the weighing of the heart. It is one of those rare scenes that survives even after people forget the culture that created it. A jackal-headed figure, a great balance, a white feather, a waiting monster. Even someone who knows nothing about Egypt often recognizes the image immediately. The remarkable question is, why this image? Why not place a scroll on the balance? Why not weigh every action individually? Why not allow witnesses to testify? The Egyptians rejected all of those possibilities because they believed something extraordinary. A lifetime cannot be measured by isolated events, only by the person who those events gradually create. The scale does not measure what you once did, it measures what your life has become. That is a profoundly different idea from simple reward and punishment. Imagine 2 people making the same mistake. One spends years learning from it, growing, changing. The other repeats it over and over until it becomes part of their identity. Outwardly, the mistake may look identical. Inwardly, they have become completely different people. The Egyptians were interested in that difference, not behavior alone. Transformation. That is why the heart, not a written record, stands upon the balance. Because a character cannot be separated from the person who formed it. And once you understand that, another mystery suddenly appears. If the heart already knew the truth, why did the Egyptians fill an entire book with secret names, hidden gateways, and mysterious formulas? Surely truth alone should have been enough. Unless the journey was never about convincing the gods, unless it was about something else entirely, something the Egyptians believed every consciousness had to learn before it could continue. Chapter 5. The journey was never through the underworld. Imagine asking an Egyptian priest a question, "Where do we go after we die?" You would probably expect him to point somewhere, toward the west, toward the horizon, toward some hidden kingdom beneath the earth. Instead, he might have answered with another question. Who is making the journey? That sounds like philosophy. To the Egyptians it was practical, because before they could describe the destination, they first had to understand the traveler. And once they did, the afterlife stopped looking like a place, it began looking like a process. This is another misunderstanding that has survived for centuries. Modern books often translate the Egyptian duat as the underworld. The word immediately creates an image: dark caves, demons, punishment, something halfway between the Greek Hades and the medieval idea of hell. The Egyptians imagined something very different. The duat was not where the dead were imprisoned, it was where consciousness was transformed. That distinction is enormous, because transformation is not the same thing as transportation. Think about the way we still describe the most important moments of life. Someone loses a child. I'm in a dark place. A woman survives cancer. I came through the other side. A man leaves a career that defined him for 30 years. I feel like I'm entering a completely different world. None of those sentences describes geography. They describe experience. The Egyptians spoke exactly the same way, only they drew the experience instead of analyzing it. To understand why, we need to leave the tomb for a moment and look upward. Every evening, the Egyptians watched the same event. The sun disappeared. It slipped beneath the western horizon and vanished into darkness. Today we call it sunset. They called it the beginning of a journey. They believed the sun god Ra entered the duat every night. Not to rest, to struggle. Every dawn represented something extraordinary, proof that order had defeated chaos one more time. To us, sunrise is predictable. To an ancient civilization, every sunrise was another miracle successfully completed. Imagine living without astronomy, without clocks, without scientific certainty. The return of the sun was not merely expected, it was celebrated, because every dawn meant creation had survived another night. Now something remarkable begins to happen. The journey of the sun and the journey of the human being start following the same pattern. Both disappear. Both enter darkness. Both face trials. Both emerge transformed. The Egyptians were telling one story twice, once in the sky, once in the human soul. That realization changes the entire purpose of the duat. It was never simply a location. It was the invisible pattern hidden inside every transformation. Carl Jung would later notice something remarkably similar. Across cultures separated by oceans and centuries, myths repeatedly describe the same structure: a descent, a confrontation, a transformation, a return. He called this one of the recurring patterns of the human psyche. The Egyptians had already drawn that pattern nearly 3,000 years earlier, not as psychology, as cosmology. The Book of Coming Forth by Day describes the duat with astonishing detail. There are rivers, mountains, lakes of fire, enormous gates, hidden caverns, 12 distinct regions corresponding to the 12 hours of the night. At first glance, it appears to be an elaborate map. Then, historians noticed something curious. Maps normally tell you where to go. The Egyptian text spends far more time explaining who you must become to continue. That is a completely different kind of map. Consider the gates. There are many of them, each guarded, each requires passage. Popular documentaries often describe these scenes as magical tests. Speak the correct password. The door opens. Fail. Remain outside forever. That interpretation has always felt strangely superficial, because the Egyptians themselves kept emphasizing one unexpected detail. Not the words, the names. Again and again, the guardian asks for recognition. Do you know who I am? That sounds almost childish until we ask a different question. Why should a gate care whether you know someone's name? Ancient Egypt held a peculiar belief. To know the true name of something was to understand its nature. Names were never arbitrary labels. They revealed the essence. Think about modern science. We often believe we understand something once we can classify it. Gravity, DNA, black holes, neuroplasticity. Naming does not magically solve the mystery, but it changes our relationship to it. The Egyptians sensed something similar. Recognition transforms experience. Imagine someone suffering panic attacks without knowing what they are. The fear feels overwhelming, uncontrollable. Then one day, a physician gives it a name. The attacks may not disappear immediately, but something important changes. Chaos acquires structure. The unknown becomes recognizable. Recognition itself becomes a form of power. Perhaps that is what the Egyptian guardians were really testing, not memory, awareness. Because every stage of the journey asks the same question in a different form. Do you understand what stands before you? And perhaps no civilization understood better than Egypt that ignorance can be far more dangerous than fear. But among every guardian, every gate, every trial, one figure stood apart from all the others, not because he protected a single passage, because he threatened existence itself. The Egyptians called him Apophis, and unlike every other obstacle in the Duat, he could never be defeated forever. Chapter 5. Continued. The enemy that could never be destroyed. Every civilization has created monsters, dragons, giants, sea serpents, demons. At first glance, they all seem to serve the same purpose: to frighten, to entertain, to explain what people could not understand. The Egyptians created monsters too, but one of them was unlike all the others. His name was Apophis, or in Egyptian, Apep. He was not the ruler of the Duat. He did not judge the dead. He did not guard a gate. In fact, he wanted something much larger. He wanted creation itself to stop. That may sound like mythology, until we ask a different question. What exactly did Apophis represent? For generations, historians simply described him as the god of chaos. Accurate, but incomplete, because chaos, to the Egyptians, did not simply mean disorder. It meant the collapse of everything that allows reality to remain reality. Imagine waking tomorrow morning and discovering that gravity worked differently every hour. Language changed every minute. Memory disappeared every evening. Promises meant nothing. The seasons arrived at random. Nothing could be trusted. Nothing remained stable. That was chaos. Not violence, disintegration, the opposite of Ma'at, the opposite of truth, the opposite of continuity. Notice how often that word keeps returning. Continuity. Everything the Egyptians valued ultimately depended upon it. The continuity of the sun, the continuity of memory, the continuity of identity, the continuity of the cosmos itself. Apophis threatened every one of them. According to the ancient texts, every single night, the solar boat of Ra entered the deepest regions of the Duat, and every single night, Apophis attacked. Not once, every night. Think about what that means. Most mythologies describe one decisive battle. Good defeats evil. Order is restored. The story ends. Egypt refused that structure. There was no final victory. Every sunrise required another struggle. Every dawn represented another successful defense of existence itself. That is an astonishingly mature observation about reality. Because life rarely works through permanent victories. No one defeats fear forever. No one conquers selfishness once and never encounters it again. No society solves injustice permanently. Order requires maintenance. The Egyptians understood that nearly 4,000 years ago. Modern psychology would describe something similar. Recovery is rarely a single event. It is repetition. Someone recovering from addiction does not make one decision. They make thousands. A marriage survives not because of one act of love, but because of countless small ones. Trust survives through maintenance. Health survives through maintenance. Character survives through maintenance. The Egyptians transformed that observation into the nightly battle between Ra and Apophis. Every day begins again, because every day the struggle begins again. Perhaps that explains another detail that often goes unnoticed. Ra never crossed the Duat alone. His boat was full. Gods, protective beings, the blessed dead. Each played a role. The survival of creation was never presented as the work of one hero. It was a shared responsibility. That idea feels surprisingly modern. Today, we know that no civilization survives through extraordinary individuals alone. It survives because millions of ordinary people quietly maintain trust, keep promises, raise children, teach students, grow food, repair bridges, tell the truth. Most of civilization is invisible maintenance. The Egyptians would probably have called all of that serving Ma'at. Because Ma'at was never merely cosmic, it was personal. Every honest decision strengthened order. Every deliberate lie strengthened chaos. Every act of justice reinforced the same balance that held the stars above the Nile. That is a breathtaking idea. Not because it can be scientifically proven, but because it refuses to separate private character from public reality. To the Egyptians, the universe was not something happening around you. You participated in it. Every day, whether you realized it or not. And perhaps that is why the Duat contain so many gates. Modern readers often imagine them as obstacles placed in the traveler's path. The Egyptians may have understood them differently. A gate is not merely something that blocks progress. It separates one way of being from another. Think about your own life. Graduating from school, becoming a parent, losing someone you love, leaving a career, recovering from illness. None of those experiences simply transports you somewhere else. They transform the person who walks through them. The Egyptians externalized that experience. Instead of saying, "Life changes you," they drew enormous gates guarded by mysterious beings. Instead of saying, "Knowledge changes consciousness," they described hidden names that had to be recognized before the journey could continue. Different language, the same insight. Transformation always demands recognition. No recognition from others, recognition from yourself. Because every gate in the Duat asks exactly the same question. Not, "Who were you?" but, "Who have you become?" And according to the Egyptians, there was only one part of the human being capable of answering that question honestly. Not the tongue, not the memory, not reputation, the heart. Which brings us back to the image that has quietly been waiting for us since the beginning of this investigation. A balance, a feather, a silent witness, and perhaps the oldest psychological insight ever carved into stone. Chapter 6. The civilization that refused to be forgotten. There is an uncomfortable irony at the center of Egyptian history. A civilization that devoted more than 3,000 years to defeating oblivion was almost erased by oblivion itself. Not physically. Its monuments survived, its temples survived, its statues survived, its tombs survived. What disappeared was something far more important: its voice. Imagine standing before one of the walls at Karnak. Every surface is covered with hieroglyphs, thousands upon thousands of perfectly carved symbols. Now imagine that no one on earth can read a single one. That was the reality for nearly 15 centuries. People walked through Egyptian temples exactly as tourists do today. They admired the scale, the architecture, the beauty. But the civilization itself had fallen silent. It was as if every library in the world still existed, while every language had been forgotten. That silence began slowly. After Egypt became part of the Roman Empire, new religions spread across the Nile. Ancient temples closed. The priesthood disappeared. The schools that had trained scribes vanished. Generation after generation, fewer people could read hieroglyphs. Until eventually, no one could. The last known hieroglyphic inscription was carved around the year 394 AD on the island of Philae. After that, silence. Think about what that really means. For almost 1,500 years, humanity looked directly at Egyptian civilization without being able to hear what it was saying. The irony is astonishing. The people who believed memory defeated death had themselves become unreadable. History had placed them inside exactly the nightmare they feared most: forgotten. Not because their buildings disappeared, because their meaning disappeared. That distinction matters. A monument without memory becomes scenery. A language no one understands becomes decoration. Identity requires interpretation. Without it, even the greatest civilization slowly dissolves into mystery. For centuries, scholars tried to solve the puzzle. Some believed hieroglyphs were mystical symbols. Others insisted they represented abstract philosophical ideas. A few imagined they concealed ancient magical knowledge. Almost everyone agreed on one thing: no one knew how to read them. Then, quite by accident, history changed. In the summer of 1799, French soldiers serving in Napoleon's Egyptian campaign were strengthening an old fort near the town of Rosetta. While removing rubble from a collapsed wall, one officer noticed an unusual stone. It was black, broken, covered with writing. At first glance, it seemed like just another fragment from a ruined monument. Fortunately, someone looked closer. The same text appeared 3 different times. One section was written in hieroglyphs, another in Demotic, the everyday script used in later Egypt. The third was written in Greek. That detail changed history, because Greek could still be read. Imagine finding a dictionary where you understand one language, but not the other. Suddenly, translation becomes possible. Not easy, but possible. The Rosetta Stone did not immediately unlock Egypt. It simply gave scholars something they had never possessed before: a bridge. For more than 20 years, researchers struggled to cross it. Many failed. Some came surprisingly close. Then, in 1822, a young French scholar named Jean-François Champollion made the breakthrough. He realized something previous generations had misunderstood. Hieroglyphs were not merely symbols. They represented sounds, names, language. The walls of Egypt were speaking again. Imagine the first moment someone stood before a temple, looked at a cartouche, and realized, this isn't decoration. Someone signed their name here. Everything changed overnight. Kings recovered their identities, officials recovered their biographies, architects recovered their achievements, ordinary workers recovered their voices, and among the countless texts emerging from that silence, one collection immediately captured worldwide attention: the funerary papyri. Ironically, this was also the moment they received the title by which the world still knows them today: the Book of the Dead. Once again, history preserved the misunderstanding. The wrong title became permanent. The original purpose remained hidden. Yet perhaps something even more remarkable happened. The Egyptians had almost suffered the fate they feared above everything else. They had almost been forgotten. Almost. Not completely. Because one stone, one scholar, and one forgotten language proved stronger than 15 centuries of silence. There is a lesson hidden inside that story. Civilizations rarely disappear all at once. First, their language changes. Then their stories fade. Then their symbols lose meaning. Eventually, people still see them, but no longer understand them. Could the same thing happen to an individual? The Egyptians believed it already could. Not after death, during life. A person could slowly lose contact with their own story, their own values, their own identity, until they no longer recognized themselves. Perhaps that is why they never separated memory from consciousness. To remember was not merely to think about the past. It was to preserve the self. And perhaps that is the oldest lesson Egypt has left us. Not that pyramids endure. Stone eventually crumbles. Not that kingdoms last forever. Empires always disappear. The thing most worth preserving, it is the invisible continuity that allows a human being to remain themselves while everything else changes. That is what the Egyptians spent 3,000 years protecting, and it is also why their oldest book was never really about death. It was about the extraordinary challenge of remaining whole. Chapter 7. The book was never about death. By now we have uncovered something that few people expect. The deeper we travel into Egyptian civilization, the less death seems to be its central concern. That sounds almost absurd. After all, no civilization built more tombs. No civilization perfected mummification to the same degree. No civilization filled graves with such astonishing care. Everything appears to revolve around death. And yet, the closer we look, the more another idea quietly replaces it. Continuity. That word has followed us since the beginning of this investigation. The body mattered, because continuity mattered. The name mattered, because continuity mattered. The heart mattered, because continuity mattered. The journey through the duat mattered, because continuity mattered. The question has never been, can a human being survive death? The question has always been, what is it that actually survives? That distinction separates Egypt from almost every modern discussion of immortality. Today, when people imagine living forever, they usually think about extending biological life. Medicine, genetics, artificial intelligence, cryonics, uploading consciousness. Different technologies pursuing the same dream, more time. The Egyptians would probably have listened with great curiosity. Then they might have asked a completely different question. Suppose you could live forever. Who exactly would be living forever? That question is far more difficult than it first appears. Imagine that every memory inside your mind could be copied perfectly into a machine. The machine speaks exactly like you, remembers your childhood, recognizes your family, laughs at the same jokes. Would that machine actually be you? Or would it simply possess information about you? Modern philosophers call this the problem of personal identity. The Egyptians reached the same crossroads without computers, neuroscience, or philosophy departments. They arrived there through observation, because they noticed something remarkably simple. Human beings change constantly. Your body today contains almost none of the cells it possessed years ago. Your opinions change, your ambitions change, your friendships change. Even your memories change every time you remember them. If everything changes, what remains continuous? That is the mystery the Book of Coming Forth by Day keeps returning to. Not life after death, identity through change. Perhaps that explains one of the book's strangest characteristics. It rarely spends time describing what eternity looks like. Instead, it spends page after page describing how consciousness moves through transformation. That difference matters, because places do not change people. Journeys do. Think about the moments that permanently shaped your own life. Your first real failure, the day you became a parent, losing someone you loved, leaving home, recovering from illness. None of those experiences mattered because of where they happened. They mattered because of who they forced you to become. The Egyptians understood that transformation always carries a price. You cannot become someone new without allowing part of the old self to disappear. That is true whether you are learning a language, recovering from grief, building a business, or becoming a wiser human being. Growth always asks the same question: what are you willing to leave behind? The Egyptians transformed that psychological process into symbols: the gates, the guardians, the weighing of the heart, the emergence into light. Different images, one recurring pattern. Transformation requires continuity. Lose the thread connecting who you were to who you are becoming, and the journey loses its meaning. Perhaps that is why the act fascinated them so deeply. The perfected human being was not someone who had escaped change. It was someone who had passed through change without losing themselves. That idea feels remarkably modern. Psychologists often describe resilience as the ability to adapt without losing one's essential identity. Not resisting change, remaining whole during change. The Egyptians might have expressed the same idea differently. The heart remained in balance. The Ba found its way home. The Ren endured. The Ak emerged. Different language, the same insight. There is another reason this ancient book still feels strangely alive. It never separates knowledge from character. Modern culture often confuses the two. We collect information, read books, watch lectures, accumulate facts. The Egyptians would probably have asked a simple question: has any of it changed you? Because information alone never interested them. Recognition did. The traveler does not pass the gates because they memorized words. The traveler passes because understanding has become part of who they are. Knowledge that fails to transform the person remains incomplete. Perhaps that is one of the oldest educational philosophies ever written. To know something completely is to become different because of it, not simply to remember it. The remarkable thing is that modern neuroscience quietly supports a similar observation. Learning physically changes the brain. Repeated actions reshape neural pathways. Attention reorganizes perception. Experience rewires identity. Again, different language, the same pattern. The Egyptians could not describe neurons. They did not need to. They observed human beings, and they noticed something timeless. Every repeated thought, every repeated action, every repeated choice quietly becomes the person making the next choice. That is why the heart remembers, not because it stores facts, because it becomes the record of a life. Which brings us back to the question with which we began. Why did the Egyptians fear forgetting more than death? After everything we have uncovered, the answer no longer seems mysterious. Because they believed death changes your circumstances. Forgetting changes you. And in their eyes, those were never the same thing. There is one final mystery, perhaps the most important one of all. If the Egyptians spent more than 3,000 years trying to preserve identity, why? Why devote entire industries to tomb construction? Why employ generations of scribes to copy funerary texts? Why build monuments on a scale no civilization had attempted before? Why preserve names with almost obsessive determination? Surely this was about more than surviving death. The answer may be hidden in one simple observation. The Egyptians almost never described eternity as an escape. They described it as continuity. That distinction matters. Imagine reading the final page of a great novel. The story ends. Now imagine reading a novel whose final page becomes the first page of another. That is closer to the Egyptian imagination. Death was not the conclusion, it was a transition. Not because existence automatically continued, but because the self had to remain capable of continuing. Everything depended on continuity, and continuity, they believed, could never be taken for granted. Think about your own life. You are not the same person you were 10 years ago. Your opinions have changed, your habits have changed, your friendships may have changed, perhaps your career, perhaps your dreams. Yet despite all those changes, something still tells you, I am the same person. Where does that feeling come from? Science still debates the answer. Some philosophers argue there is no permanent self at all. Others believe identity emerges from memory. Some neuroscientists describe the self as a continuously updated model created by the brain. The Egyptians would have listened with great interest. Then they might have quietly replied, exactly. That continuity is what we spent 3,000 years trying to protect. Perhaps that explains why Egyptian civilization appears strangely calm when speaking about death. Fear is surprisingly rare in their texts. Preparation is everywhere. Almost every spell inside the Book of Coming Forth by Day assumes something remarkable. The traveler is expected to learn, to recognize, to remember. The emphasis falls not on begging for mercy, but on understanding reality. That alone separates the Egyptian worldview from many later traditions. Knowledge mattered, recognition mattered, awareness mattered. Not because knowledge possessed magical power, because ignorance created separation, and separation threatened continuity. There is another detail that modern readers often overlook. The Book of Coming Forth by Day was never hidden. It was buried. Those are very different ideas. Hidden things are meant never to be found. Buried things are expected to be discovered. Every papyrus placed inside a tomb assumed a future reader. Originally, that reader was the deceased. Today, unexpectedly, it is us. 4,000 years later, we have become participants in a conversation the original scribes never imagined. That may be one of history's most extraordinary coincidences, or perhaps it isn't a coincidence at all, because the questions that shaped Egypt have never disappeared. They simply changed the vocabulary. Today we ask, what creates consciousness? The Egyptians asked, what allows consciousness to continue? Today we ask, can memory be preserved digitally? The Egyptians carved memories into stone. Today we ask, can identity survive radical change? The Egyptians answered through the journey of the Ba. Today we study neuroplasticity. They studied character. Different methods, the same search. That may explain why Egypt continues to fascinate generation after generation, not because its civilization was mysterious, because it was recognizable. The symbols appear ancient, the questions feel immediate. Who am I? What remains when everything changes? How do I avoid becoming someone I no longer recognize? No civilization has produced a final answer. Perhaps none ever will. But Egypt left something almost as valuable, a framework, a way of asking better questions. Perhaps that is what great civilizations ultimately contribute, not certainty, perspective. The Greeks taught humanity to question, the Romans taught humanity to organize, the Renaissance taught humanity to observe, the scientific revolution taught humanity to measure. Ancient Egypt taught humanity something quieter. Remember. Remember who you are. Remember what shapes you. Remember that identity is built long before anyone notices. Remember that a character accumulates one ordinary decision at a time. Remember that every habit becomes another stone in the architecture of the self. And perhaps most importantly, remember that forgetting rarely happens all at once. It happens gradually. One compromise, one distraction, one abandoned value, one postponed conversation, one ignored truth. Until eventually, a person wakes up and quietly wonders, how did I become someone I never intended to be? The Egyptians believed that was the real danger, not physical death, the slow disappearance of the self while life continued. That is why they feared forgetting more than dying. And perhaps, after 4,000 years, their oldest lesson is still their most relevant one. Because in an age overflowing with information, the rarest thing is no longer knowledge. It is remembering what truly deserves never to be forgotten. Epilogue. The last lesson of ancient Egypt. Imagine that tomorrow morning every pyramid disappeared. The Great Pyramid, the Sphinx, Karnak, Luxor, Abu Simbel, every temple, every obelisk, every museum collection, gone. Would Egypt disappear? At first the answer seems obvious. Of course it would. Without its monuments, what would remain? But history has already answered that question, because there was a time when the monuments still stood, and Egypt had almost disappeared anyway. Not because its stones had crumbled, because no one could understand what they meant. That may be the final lesson this civilization leaves behind. A culture is not preserved by its buildings. It is preserved by its meaning. The Egyptians understood that better than almost anyone. That is why they carved stories into stone, not simply because stone lasts longer than papyrus, but because they hoped someone, someday, would read them again. In a sense, that hope succeeded. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. 4,000 years later, we are still asking the questions they carved into temple walls. Who am I? What remains when everything changes? What makes one life different from another? Can a person disappear before they die? Can identity survive transformation? Remarkably, those questions no longer belong only to Egypt. They belong to neuroscience, to psychology, to philosophy, to artificial intelligence. Every time scientists debate whether a machine could ever become conscious, they are asking a question the Egyptians would immediately recognize. Every time doctors study Alzheimer's disease, they confront the same mystery. If memory disappears, what remains of the person? Every time psychologists help someone rebuild their identity after trauma, they are walking through another version of the duat. Different language, the same investigation. Perhaps that explains why civilizations continue returning to Egypt. Not because the Egyptians possessed supernatural knowledge, not because pyramids contain hidden energy, not because every ancient legend is literally true, but because they looked directly at one of the deepest questions a human being can ask, and refused to look away. They understood something that modern life often encourages us to forget. A human being is not built in dramatic moments. Identity forms quietly. Ordinary conversations, ordinary habits, ordinary promises, ordinary acts of honesty, or ordinary compromises. Every day, something is being added to the heart, not literally, symbolically. The person you are becoming is never created all at once. It is assembled, one decision after another. That may be why the weighing of the heart remains one of the most enduring images in human history. Not because anyone can prove such a ceremony exists after death, because almost everyone has experienced its psychological equivalent. There are moments when reputation no longer matters, when explanations no longer matter, when excuses become strangely silent, and only one question remains. What has this life made of me? The Egyptians believed no god needed to invent the answer. The answer already existed. It had been written slowly, through years of choices, years of habits, years of relationships, years of becoming. Perhaps that is why Anubis never appears angry. Look carefully at the ancient illustrations. He is calm, almost patient. He does not force the scales. He does not argue with them. He simply allows reality to reveal itself. That may be the most profound image Egypt ever created. Truth does not shout. Truth waits, quietly, until the moment we are finally willing to see it. At the beginning of this audiobook, we asked why the Egyptians feared forgetting more than death. Now the answer seems almost inevitable. Because death changes where your story continues. Forgetting changes whether there is still a story to continue at all. To forget your values, to forget your purpose, to forget your character, to forget the promises that shaped your life. That is the real disappearance. Not the end of biological life, the end of continuity. Perhaps that is why the original title now feels so different. The Book of Coming Forth by Day, not the Book of the Dead. Coming forth, emerging, returning to the light, again. Every sunrise became a reminder that continuity was still possible. Every morning offered another opportunity to remember who you intended to become. Perhaps that was always the deeper meaning hidden beneath the rituals. The book was never waiting for death. It was waiting for dawn. And perhaps, after 4,000 years, that is still what it asks of every reader. Not to fear dying, but to refuse the quieter danger, the slow forgetting of the person you were capable of becoming. Because in the end, the greatest monument the Egyptians ever built was never a pyramid. It was an idea. The idea that a human being is not remembered by the length of life, but by the continuity of character. Stone eventually erodes, empires eventually fall, languages eventually fade. But a question powerful enough to survive 4,000 years may be closer to immortality than anything ever carved into granite. And perhaps that is why even today, when the first light touches the pyramids each morning, the oldest book in Egypt still seems to whisper the same invitation it has offered since the banks of the Nile first gave birth to a civilization. Come forth by day. Remember who you are.